Let's start with Jimmy Carter. He just passed away
Yeah.
at the 100.
Mm,
And there's a lot of discussion report about his death in China because he's the one who established the official diplomatic
mm.
relationship between People's Republic China and the US. So he's important in that sense. And he also made it very clear. He actually made an announcement to the American public on TV. So everything is recorded that he said that there's but one China, Taiwan is part of China. So that has been played, in China continuously. What is your assessment? So in China, he's regarded very positive in that sense. He contributed positively to
Yes.
the relationship between the two countries. So what is your take, your assessment about Jimmy Carter?
Right. Well, I'm somewhat more sympathetic to him than I think many people in the United States are today. In the sense that I think he became president at a very difficult time in the United States. The country had just been defeated in the Vietnam War. There'd just been the oil crisis. There was a lot of anger and bad feeling, and the mood in the US at that time was very, very bad. And this is exactly the same period when the neocons organized and prepared their massive pushback, which eventually led to them successfully taking over the US government.
Mhm.
And of course, he had a divided administration, which is partly his own fault, but he had a very, very capable and good Secretary of State who was Cyrus Vance, whom I remember very well. And
Mhm.
of course, as National Security Advisor, he had the neocon in chief, who was Zbigniew Brzezinski.
Mhm.
So in domestic policy, I don't think he achieved very much, but given the times, it would have been very difficult for him to achieve very much. I mean, it was a period of high inflation, which was a product of the Vietnam War. He'd
Mhm.
not been responsible for the Vietnam War. It was going to take time for that to unwind. He got the blame for it, and that was unfair on him. He managed the relationship with China in the end very well. He
Mhm.
had a clear understanding of the realities. He had a genuine respect for the Chinese people, which is rare amongst US politicians, especially at that time. I mean, it's strange to say this, but I can remember in the 1970s that there was still in Congress a very strong so-called China lobby.
Mhm.
Now, this wasn't a China lobby; it was an anti-China lobby, and most prominent figures was, believe it or not, Madam Chiang Kai-shek, who was still
Yeah,
alive
that's
at
right.
that time. I mean, I can remember all of
Yeah.
that. So I mean, so they were still there. They were very powerful.
Mhm.
They were pulling every string that they could to prevent diplomatic relations being established. But Carter himself had a genuine liking for the Chinese people. He had a background in agriculture,
Mhm.
and China as an important agricultural power, he had a kind of affinity with it, I think. I don't think that's an overstatement.
Mhm.
And anyway, he eventually won through, and in my opinion, it was the single greatest achievement of his presidency, and not a small one, by the way.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, the rest of his foreign policy, I have to say this, I think was unsuccessful. He
Mhm.
had the opportunity of his predecessors, going all the way back to JFK, but he didn't.
Mhm.
And in fact, relations with the Soviet Union got much worse during the time that he was president. The United States got involved in the Afghan wars against the Soviets at that time. But as we all know, in the long term, it proved utterly disastrous. And I think that he also didn't really understand the Middle East.
Mhm.
Instead of working with the big Arab states, with the Saudis and with the Russians, to agree the peace conference in Geneva that had been agreed as a condition for ending the 1973 Arab Israeli war. Instead of pressing forward with that, he got sidetracked onto this policy of a separate peace between Egypt and Israel, which is an easy diplomatic win, but in the long term, a disaster, in my opinion, throwing away the best opportunity for peace between the Arab states and Israel, and the best opportunity to resolve the Palestinian problem, which has existed, which was, as I said, this peace conference that everybody had agreed to go to in Geneva. And the result is the catastrophic situation in the Middle East that we have today. So I think that he was a well-intentioned man, rather out of his depth, but he did have this one achievement, which was peace with China.
Yeah. I saw him one time when I was in Emory University. So he came to give a speech. Emory is in Georgia, in Atlanta. So that's where he's based. The Carter Center is based in Atlanta. So he came and talked to us. I find that he's a nice guy. I actually think as a person, he's more likable than, for example, Biden.
Oh, no, there is no comparison. I'm going to add something else. Having lived through that time, the abuse he received from the media was just off the scale. I mean, they were always presenting him as weak, as being a pushover by the Russians, the Iranians, everybody. Completely not true. And it would have required a very, very strong personality to just break through all of that and to keep the United States on its proper course. He didn't have that strength of personality or that level of experience to do it. And coming back to what you've just said about him, I think ultimately his problem was he just was altogether too nice. I mean, it needed, in order to succeed as president at that time, you needed to be either someone with the incredible charisma of JFK and the ruthlessness, the political ruthlessness of JFK, or you needed to be the similarly ruthless and utterly corrupt and twisted and devious personalities that Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon both were. But they nonetheless did achieve quite a lot as they were president. He was just too nice and too straightforward and too honest and too innocent in the end to be president at that time, or indeed any time since.
Yeah, I like him as a person, much more so that I feel like right now how I feel like Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden, those kind of figures. Even the Barack Obama, I can't stand them. They're too fake, but maybe that's what needed. I don't know. And
well, I mean, unfortunately, politics is a very dirty game, and he just wasn't quite the man to get his hands dirty in the way that he needed to do.
Yeah. Another thing is, is it true that National Security Advisor wasn't that important until Nixon time when Kissinger became his? Is that what happened? National Security Advisor.
This is absolutely correct. I mean, before, if you're talking about, the previous periods, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, the key figure always was the Secretary of State. He was in charge of foreign policy. Then Nixon decided basically that he would be his own Secretary of State. His original Secretary of State was a man called William Rogers, who nobody took very seriously. He needed somebody to provide him with, intellectual help. He got Henry Kissinger, one of the most ruthless and cynical and corrupt and at the same time very clever individuals ever to enter the US government. Kissinger set out almost from the first moment to basically undermine Rogers, in which he succeeded completely. And by mid-time through Nixon's presidency, the National Security Advisor was a far more powerful figure than the Secretary of State was.
And then later he became the Secretary of State, I think. And then he kind of like took the power with him. So he's always
absolutely. It's a unique position in American political history where Kissinger combined the role of Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. But he was always more National Security Advisor than Secretary of State. I would add that in the brief period of Gerald Ford's presidency, it was obviously Kissinger who was running everything in foreign policy terms.
Okay, so South Korea, I saw you had an episode in Duran. Can you tell us how you feel about what's going on in South Korea, because they now impeached the acting president.
Yeah.
And so it's total chaos right now. So what is going on there?
It is total chaos because the people who organized a failed coup attempt are clinging on to their institutional position in South Korea. So we've had a vote from the parliament to impeach the president who announced the martial law decree. The president himself and his successor as acting president, who is a member of the president's party, are refusing to fill vacancies in the Constitutional Court, which has to rule on the legality of the impeachment. There is only just enough judges on the Constitutional Court to vote to impeach the president, but it's uncertain whether they all would, because some of them have their own political loyalties. So this is a clear attempt to basically sabotage the impeachment process, to keep the current president, who's discredited and unpopular and has done a profoundly illegal thing and has been impeached, to keep him in power and to keep the current regime, if you like, in power, even though it is massively unpopular and has clearly failed. But there it is.
But what's going to happen? They're going to be chaotic for a while then in South Korea, seems like. Is that?
Yes.
It will
well,
continue?
it seems to me that South Korea currently has no effective government because the current president has no authority and no prestige. Is deeply unpopular in the country. The acting president has been impeached, has had to step down. The finance minister is going to take over, but he also is from the president's party. It's the same small clique of people who are trying to retain control of the country. They're not really able to govern. They're not allowing elections to happen because they know that if there were elections, the opposition would win by a landslide. So the result is what we in Greece refer to as stasis, a situation where everything has got jammed and nothing can move. And in Greek political theory, and I'm talking about ancient Greek political theory, what people like Aristotle used to write, that is the worst condition of all for a state. Stasis is often seen in Greek political thinking as a precursor to a civil war. Now, I'm not saying it's going to come to that in South Korea, but it's a very, very bad situation. And one has to ask why. Why are they doing this? Well, there have to be some explanations for this. And I suspect the reason is that they realize that the group of people who were involved in the coup was much wider than we've been told. So they don't want proper investigations. And I suspect that some of those people are to be found in the US Embassy and probably in Washington as well. So I think that this is what this is all about now.
Yes, that's what the Chinese media, some analysts are saying, that the reason Jung himself is still clinging there is he believes he has the backing of the US. That's part of what he counted on. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So we'll see.
Absolutely.
Yeah. There were several plane crash. So let's start with the Azerbaijan one. Is it true? It seems like it is shut down by Russia by mistake. Is that what happened?
Yes. I think so. I mean, again, you can come up with all kinds of alternative theories, and some people are, but it seems far and away the most likely explanation. That the plane was flying to Grozny, which is the capital of Chechnya, which is of course part of Russia. Grozny was under attack by Ukrainian drones, including around in the area of the airport. Russian air defenses, understandably, were active. Into the middle of all of this flew this passenger plane, and it's likely that it got strafed and jammed. Some of its systems got jammed, and that this is what ultimately caused it to crash. So it's a tragedy. Now, Putin has telephoned the president of Azerbaijan and has apologized. He's provided an explanation. There's reports that there's been a follow-up call that the Kremlin has not yet reported it, but it looks very much as if in the follow-up call, he has probably gone further and is going to offer compensation. So it looks to me as if the Russians are assuming responsibility for what has happened. It's the kind of thing that happens in wars. It's a tragic event. One has to be very sorry for the people involved. The president of Azerbaijan is making some rude noises about the Russians, which is probably what you would expect in this situation. I think in a short time, this incident is going to be closed. I don't really have much more to say about it than that, actually.
Well, and then you followed, there were like 3-4 events now. One is the South Korean one that is deadly. I think 179 people were killed. And then followed by Norwegian airline and the Canada, they all have a problem. And then I just read that there seems like a second plane in Korean airline that had some issue. It seems like they all have the same issue, which is the landing gear issue. That seems like the problem. So and they also are all Boeing 737-800 model. So now the talk is, okay, that seems like a technical problem from Boeing again. My question is, we have been talking about this so long. How come I don't see any action from Boeing or from the US government to do something about all these things? Right?
Yes. I mean, just to make a quick point. I mean, the Azerbaijani aircraft was an Embraer, Brazilian aircraft, completely different from all of these others. By the way, I forgot to mention the pilots who were flying it were Russians. Just to say they were Russian nationals. Both of them were killed. But just a minor detail. But these others are, as you rightly say, all Boeing 737s. Boeing lost its way years ago, and nothing that's been done has fixed the problem, because it's lost its technological and industrial expertise. It's gone the way of so many American companies focusing on financial engineering rather than real engineering, and it doesn't seem to be able to fix the problems. At the same time, it is a huge company. It's an enormously important company in terms of the US industrial system and the US military industrial complex. So it can't be closed, it can't be allowed to fail. So the problems just go on and on and on, and they become more and more dangerous. And Airbus, of course, is the rival, but it can't produce enough planes. There's a big market opportunity for China when its aircraft industry takes off. I'm not being funny. I'm being serious here, because clearly the Western airline industry is no longer able to supply safe and reliable products as it once did.
Yeah, I think like instead of talking so much about bring back this and bring back that, why don't you fix the things that you already have, like a Boeing, right? Why doesn't he fix something?
Well, you are completely right. You're absolutely correct about this. I mean, that ought to be the priority. Sort out the engineering schools, get proper engineers worked out, see about sorting out the management in these companies. It takes time. You need a 10-20 year program to do that. China can do it. America? Today's America?
I sent you the link about this article, right? This Chinese scholar who wrote
Yeah.
on the foreign affairs. The title
Mm,
is Why China Isn't Scared
mm.
of Trump. No war, but China is not afraid. China is ready. What did you get a chance to read it? What
Yes, I did.
okay, so what is your
It, it conveys exactly my feeling reading those parts of the Chinese media that I can access because, of course, I don't speak
Mhm,
or I cannot read Chinese. So I have to be based, I have to base my views on what the English language Chinese media is saying, which is, yes, I think the Chinese can see that Trump is coming along. He's saying all sorts of horrible things about China because that appeals to his base. But ultimately, I think that provided he focuses on America's problems, the Chinese are confident that they can deal with him. And if he does decide to go further, they can deal with him anyway. I think I think the title of the article is a bit misleading, actually, because I don't think China's scared of anybody.
mhm,
Frankly, I
mhm.
mean, I think there are lots of people who are scared of China, sometimes with good cause. I mean, I think, if you're a Taiwan separatist, maybe you should be scared of China.
Mhm,
But I don't think that China itself is afraid of anyone at all at the moment.
mhm.
I see no sign that it is. Why
Yeah,
would they be afraid of Donald Trump?
yeah,
I mean, this
yeah.
is London, central London, and we can't get reliable internet any longer.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, speaking of yeah, we were talking about China is not not
Mm,
afraid.
mm,
There's another article on the Wall Street Journal. The
mm,
title is Raimondo, which is Gina Raimondo, right? Gina Raimondo, the
mm,
Secretary of Commerce. Raimondo says holding back China in chips race is a fool's errand. So from that article, what you can read is that she basically saying it's almost like a mistake to limit the export of
yeah,
U.S. chips. Uh,
yes.
U.S. should invest instead. I mean, isn't that pretty straightforward, pretty obvious?
Absolutely.
Should just figure it out.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those. It's one of the, one of those situations where you almost feel like you're looking at a cartoon, and the sort of light goes on just over somebody's head because suddenly, dang, they've understood the obvious thing. That's absolutely right. I mean, the story of the Biden administration is these ridiculous restrictions on China obtaining, advanced chips, which are spurring development of China's chips industry, and of a complete, absolute, utter failure
Mhm,
of the United States, of the Biden administration, to actually promote the development of the US's own chip microprocessor industry. I was actually reading an article about this, and if you look at the industrial failure on this front in the United States, it is astonishing. I mean, they gave all the money to Intel, and Intel wasn't able to deliver, and
mhm,
Nvidia isn't doing as well as people say it is, and all kinds of other problems. So billions have been sunk into this, and there is absolutely nothing to show for it. Like, by the way, I was also reading about electric cars, that
mhm,
the US, the Biden administration invested huge amount on upgrading infrastructure, and they spent $8 billion on charging stations, and they were able to build eight
mhm.
eight charging points.
Yeah.
So that's 1 billion per charging stop. I mean, I'm not saying those are the only ones that exist in the US. Obviously, companies
Mhm,
themselves built them, but I mean, the actual US government has been able to produce 8 of them. So, I mean, this is the problem. These are the problems that the United States is experiencing today.
mhm,
Um, Trying to stop competition, all that does, and it's been proved to be the case time and again, is it causes stagnation in your own industry.
mhm. And I got some figure here. Now
Mm,
we toward the end of 2024. So,
mm,
like China's share of the global market for mature chips in last year was 33%. I believe that now what I read, this is Asia Times saying the projection is that China will reach like almost a 40% by 2027. But actually, I think I saw some Chinese numbers. It's close to 40% even at the end of this year.
Yeah.
So that's pretty pretty impressive. And now they're talking about the mature chips, which is low-end chips, but the high-end chips actually is smaller, much smaller market, right? So, and there China also has breakthroughs. The other number is the trade numbers. So with so much restriction here and there, sanctions, January to November 2024, the trade with the US expanded at 4.2%, which with the increase of the export, China to US export is 4.9%, and import China from US is increased to 2.9%, which means, with all much talking about the tech war, trade war, doesn't seem slow it down. Maybe it slowed down a little bit, but can we say so far, it has failed, the trade war, the tech war?
It has completely failed, and it will go on failing because it is the wrong solution to the wrong problem. The problem is not China. The problem, as we've just been discussing, is the US's own is its own technology and industrial failures. Unless these are solved, the United States is going to have to import things from countries like China. I mean, it should import them anyway, because we all live in a connected world, and the whole nature of trade is that people buy and sell things and shouldn't be impeded and restricted or prevented from doing so. But if you do what the US government is doing, which is constantly increasing supply of money in the United States, borrowing constantly, spending money in all kinds of things, you are going to create demand. That demand has to be satisfied. Your own factories are making things. They're going to have to buy them from the world's biggest manufacturer, which is China. It is logical.
Yeah, I still think Trump's task really is to be more focused inside US, not distracted by all this.
Yes, absolutely.
But we will talk about China later. But there's one more thing that a lot of the Chinese media, but not just Chinese media, but the US media paid attention is, of course, in the weapon, the military front. Two big things happen. I mean, there's other things too, but one is the 076 amphibious assault ship that has been finished and is testing. The other is this sixth generation fighter jet, the stealth fighter jet, the J-35, or some places call it the J-36, whatever. So those two things that got lots of attention. What is your take on that? Why does China doing this kind of a show off at the end of the year?
Well, I think there may be some element of that, but I don't think it's a huge. I mean, it's important to remember the Chinese New Year isn't. I mean, I understand they do follow the Western calendar in some things, but I mean, this isn't. It's not quite the same. I don't think it's showing off. It is the gradual, steady build-up of Chinese military power. Which has been provoked by the United States. I mean, we make this point in program after program. It doesn't change the fact that it is also true. China isn't threatening the United States. It's not seeking to dominate or subjugate the United States, but it will protect itself. It's a huge country. It has enormous manufacturing capacity. It has tremendous technological strengths now, at least equal to those of the United States. It can absolutely produce advanced fighter jets and amphibious warfare ships and things of that kind. Maybe the Americans can't, but that's not to say the Chinese can't.
I made an episode for my Chinese audience about this still the sixth generation. So I was trying to learn it myself. Well, what does each generation's fighter jet means? One thing I noticed, which I find is an important concept we need to understand, is the US have the monopoly and the control over lots of definitions. So when I was looking at the different generations, I noticed the first generation, they put out like what the US have produced and the Soviet has produced. There was no mention whatsoever of German. But the reality is the very first fighter jet actually is a German one. They used it during World War II.
Yeah.
You would think from, step 0 to 1 is the most important step. But the German, fighter jet wasn't even mentioned in any of
No.
these generations. I just feel like, okay, that's not unique. It's the US like to define,
Yes.
they control the definition of lots of things, isn't it?
This is exactly right, and I suspect this applies also to the J-35 or 36 or whatever it is. And I'm not an expert on these
Yeah,
generations of fighter jets. Can I just say straight away?
yeah.
But what I suspect has happened is that the Chinese, like the Russians, by the way, don't apply these standards to themselves.
Mhm.
They have a requirement. They need a capability, and they produce it. It's as simple
Mhm.
as this.
Mhm.
I don't think they're saying to themselves, "Well, we have to develop an aircraft that ticks all these particular American boxes." I don't think it works that way.
Mhm. But the US does have, in terms of its propaganda, I mean, it is a powerful tool. I mean,
Mm.
US is the one who defined what democracy, for example.
Yeah.
It defines what freedom is, right? And so I find like lots of times that they have the upper hand in the sense like they always criticize you and that, China this and China is because they have the monopoly of definition. I mean, in terms of, for example, democracy, how do you even define democracy? I mean, do I have democracy? Living in the US, yes, in Virginia, where I live, we have elections every year because the
Mm.
local election is not totally lined up with the federal, election. So we have election every year, but I don't feel that I'm well represented. My congressman, for example, doesn't really care whatsoever, how I feel about anything. So, but the US is the one who controls the definition of democracy. So US can say you are a democratic country or you're not. It's entirely kind of US has that power, that monopoly. It's a pretty powerful tool, though, propaganda tool.
That is the single most powerful tool the United
Hmm.
States has. I mean, that and the dollar. The dollar
Yeah.
is fading.
Hmm.
This other ability to dominate and control the narrative, that remains its single greatest political asset. And for the moment, it's only been challenged very much on the margins.
Hmm.
So to go back to your definition, the point you make about democracy, you're not only absolutely right, but you can see the way in which it's misused. I mean, a Romanian election is annulled.
Yeah.
Nobody complains or says anything about it. I mean, in ways that once in the European Union, I would have thought inconceivable.
Hmm.
Um, Nobody says that's an attack on democracy. That's a defense of democracy. uh, in South Korea, the South Korean president tries to arrest his political opponents, dissolve parliament, and rule by decree. And he's not criticized in the same way. And again, the narrative, um, as far as most of the world is concerned, isn't about democracy and the
Hmm.
existential struggle that's going on. So the Americans absolutely set the scene for this. Um, and I'm afraid we have to accept that they're going to continue to do so for at least the next decade. We're going to continue to live in this
Hmm.
world of narratives that the United States has been so skillful in constructing. One of the saddest comments that Putin made, by the way, in that
Hmm.
huge article he gave, interview he gave to Tucker Carlson, was when he said it is impossible, all but impossible, to win a propaganda war against the United States.
Yeah. 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 It's just a little bit surprising to me that even
Mm,
on things like
mm,
how to define a first generation fighter jet, that is such important to,
yeah,
Germany contributed such important step, not even
yeah,
mentioned.
no, I know, completely true.
I mean, they mentioned some French and the British, which
Yeah.
not nearly as important as the German ones, but okay.
No, no. The German fighter jet, the Messerschmitt 262.
Yeah.
I remember. I've actually spoken to somebody who encountered it in battle. By the way,
Uh-huh.
and pretty awed they were by it. As you correctly said, that was apparently by far and away the most advanced fighter jet of its time.
Yeah.
But of course, it doesn't appear anywhere on the
No.
list of generations. Yes.
Yeah, this is the table that I saw on
Yeah.
Wikipedia that they put in the different generations.
Yeah.
And the German ones wasn't even mentioned. I was
Yes.
like, okay.
Yeah.
Trump. Now, Trump has been talking about some properties. He's talking about the Canada. He wanted Canada to be the 51 state, the Panama Canal, and then the Greenland. So he was a property developer. I mean, developer. So he likes property. It seems like. Can we take any of this seriously? He just saying it, or
Yes.
there's
Yes, I think we can,
okay.
if we understand it correctly. I mean, it's typical Trump. It's unbelievably crude. It's in fact brutally crude. It treats other countries with an extraordinary degree of disdain. I mean, nobody in Greenland is aching to join the United States. Denmark, so they've already said that, as far as they're concerned, Greenland is not for sale. And yet, they just plow on. Trump and his people continue to talk about this. The way Trump talks about Mexico is really awful. I mean, especially if you know about the history of US-Mexican relations. I mean, it's awful the way he talks. And about the way he talks about Canada is brutal as well. I don't think he means it exactly as he says it, but I do think that he is expressing what he's articulating, more than expressing, within the US, a point of view which is beginning to gain traction, which is that the era of the United States as a global hegemon is ending. And what the United States needs to start to do instead is to concentrate on its own region. In other words, to gain secure and unchallengeable control of its own sphere of influence. So instead of treat the whole world as a kind of sphere of influence, it should start looking at those places that are strategically important to itself and ensuring that these are controlled by the US. Greenland, Canada, and Mexico being obvious ones.
Well, the Panama Canal, I think,
Yeah.
and both, I think Greenland and the Panama Canal has got lots of traction. People pay lots of attention in China now because Panama Canal is, my understanding, has experienced some pretty bad drought, so the water level is low. And so they had the Chinese company to help them to do some maintenance there. And then also China has some port they are managing or something. So I think this is the counter by Trump or people around him to counter China. I mean, he's talking about that, and everything is about it. Down to it, it will be big because of China.
Well, of course it is. Can I say, I repeat that, and that is exactly what this is all about. Now, Greenland, geographically, apparently, it's a complete arbitrary thing, but it's considered part of North America rather than Europe, even though it was discovered long before the rest of North America. So, here you have the Chinese, and they're doing things in part of North America. And this is obviously a threat to the United States. So they must gain control of it as part of their sphere of influence. So I'm absolutely sure that this is the core of this issue. The Panama Canal obviously has important military significance because it means that the United States is able to move its fleets from the Atlantic to the Pacific backwards and forwards and redeploy them relatively fast. And that, by the way, was one of the major reasons it was built in the first place and why it was considered for a long time a strategic asset. So given that you're facing, or you're telling yourself that you're facing, a big naval challenge from China, you want to be able to do that and to do that securely and make sure that the canal isn't going to be closed to you by some independent government in Panama, which wants good relations with China. It's all about China. It always is about China. Everything the US is doing is about China. The Americans, as I said before, have China on the brain. Chinese people do need to understand that.
Yeah, and the Greenland, you're right. I think it's China and the US. Here I have a quote. I forgot. It's probably from BBC or The Guardian. Says, until now, Denmark has been very slow to expand its military capacity in Greenland, they say. But if country is not able to protect waters around the territory against encroachments by China and Russia, then US demands for greater control are likely to grow. So that's what this is about, I guess. So,
Absolutely. That's
yeah.
exactly what it's about. I mean, the Russians, obviously, but bear in mind that the Russians are, of course, already in the Arctic. For them to really get through to Greenland, it's the old story of, they have to pass the Faroe Islands, Shetland, all those that sort of gap. Reach Greenland itself. The Russians aren't really a challenge to the Americans there, but Chinese economic penetration in Greenland, that's absolutely the kind of thing that keeps American leaders awake at night. I mean, it sounds absurd, but it's true.
And they don't have that anymore. They used to talk about the freedom of navigation. They would say, okay, we need, freedom of navigation. But now it's very clear it's about encroachments, by China and Russia. So
of course it is. Of course it is. Freedom of navigation is when the United States is doing it. Threats to world peace is when China and Russia are doing it, especially when China is doing it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, then in that case, because Trump seems very interested in all these properties, can we say Trump is still an imperialist? He's not that interested in having war, but he still wants control. He still wants expansion, right?
I don't have any doubt about this at all. Of course, he's an imperialist. He is a rather more old-fashioned and more unashamed imperialist than the ones we have now. I mean, he doesn't, as I said, waste his time with all this rhetoric about human rights and freedoms and all of that. I mean, he doesn't take that very seriously himself, and he doesn't really believe in it. But he absolutely believes in American power and American interests, and he wants to preserve those. He just has a different approach to doing it. So, as I said, Biden wanted to create this global alliance of so-called democracies, countries that the US chose and decided were democracies, which they were going to launch against the axis of autocracies, which of course means China and its friends. He thought in terms of some great sweeping global struggle with a very strong ideological component. Trump isn't interested in ideology. He sees things in terms of raw interest and power. He says, this is where the US is. We need to control all of these territories around Canada, Mexico, the Panama Canal, Greenland, other places, no doubt. And that's obviously an imperialist vision. But in some ways, it's a somewhat more, shall we say, it works at a less grandiose level than the neocon one does.
Yeah, the thing I think the reason that he's much better perceived in China than Biden, for example, is he's much more straightforward, right? This is what I want, for America. And then, so he doesn't
absolutely. There are a few genuine anti-imperialists in senior, politics in the United States. Ron Paul is a genuine anti-imperialist. David Stockman, whose article I was reading about Syria, is an anti-imperialist. In terms of the American political class, you can count these people on your fingers. I mean, they are not representative of the wider political class. Any American leader at this time in American history is an imperialist of one type or another, by definition.
Okay, to Europe. So Georgia's new president was sworn in, but the outgoing president, she refused to step down. How does it work?
It's very simple. She's no longer the president. He is. She made a huge story about how she was going to barricade herself in the presidential residence and refuse to leave.
Uh-huh.
And there was all sorts of expectations that, they'd have to break in the door and drag her out, and then she'd go to prison or something of that kind. In the event, it didn't happen. I mean, she didn't want to go to prison. She did leave, and he's now the president. So she goes about telling people that she's still the president. She addresses the crowds in Tbilisi saying that she's the president. But I think actually she's lost a lot of face. She's not, I think, taken particularly seriously anymore. So for the moment, the government in Georgia has prevailed. I mean, they seem to be close to seeing this color revolution off.
Yeah, even the West doesn't seem to do what they did with Venezuela, just refuse to recognize the elected president.
No.
Right? They haven't done so. I mean, they have been quiet, right? Is that they kind of like...
Yes, because they realize that the color revolution has failed. And they also understand that if they take that step, if they refuse to recognize the current president and they refuse to recognize the current government, given that the government is in firm control of the country, and given that it seems to have a clear majority of people in the country supporting it, the risk they run by not recognizing it is that it will have to find trading partners and friends, and it will find them in China and Russia.
So
Serbia.
Serbia, I actually didn't know that Serbia has a large deposit of lithium, so which make it even more complicated. But anyway, so the Chinese media said that all what's going on in Serbia is George Soros is behind it. Now, I also read recently that George Soros is banned in Russia, Pakistan, Turkey, Hungary, Poland, and the Philippines, apparently. But then somebody debunked that, saying that's not true, that's not true. But nonetheless, I feel like George Soros is a person that is utterly dangerous. And can you talk a little bit about the last time we talked about Paul Wolfowitz being the deep state person, and I think Soros is like that, and plus he's also globalist, right? So what is your...
My envy about Soros is that Wolfowitz obviously functioned within the US government. Soros, what he does, what he's been about is that he has been instrumental in projecting American power. Now, there are a lot of uncertainties and mysteries about Soros, and I'm not going to try and unpack them myself. But what basically happened was that back in the 1970s, there was a series of investigations in the United States of the CIA and what it had been up to because of all kinds of scandals that had emerged in the 1960s and early 1970s. And the operations of the CIA were supposed to be scaled down. But what in practice happened was that the CIA continued to operate in exactly the same way that as it had done before, but started increasingly to use various private agencies and individuals as cover for the things that it was doing. And in fact, because a lot of it was done purportedly by these private entities and individuals, the ultimate result of the changes that happened in the 1970s is that this covert activity exploded in scale because it happens outside the regulatory arm of the US government and of the courts and things of that kind. So the rules, the law may say that the CIA can do this, but it can't do that, it can't do something else. But it doesn't say that George Soros and his Open Society Foundation cannot do these things. So I think that in ways that has never been fully explained, Soros does what the intelligence people in Washington want him to. I think he's absolutely a part of the political state of the United States. And I think that this is a guess now, I may be
Mhm.
completely wrong, I may
Mhm.
be doing the man an injustice, but I think in return they give him continuous tips about developments in world markets and things of that kind, and that's one of the reasons why he's achieved so much wealth. So he gets paid back in that way.
Mhm. Well, that that kind of explains, because I always wondered that he seems like a businessman, a banker or investor or what have you.
Mm,
But very deeply involved in different countries' politics, right? Through his open society. And
yes.
kind of like a color revolution, one after another. It seems like he's always there somehow. But that's probably makes sense. Yeah.
I'm going to add something else, which is the fact that he calls his thing, the Open Society
Okay.
Foundation and all of that, is itself an alarm bell, because
Hmm.
that originates from a book that was written by a British philosopher called Karl Popper back in the early 1950s, entitled The Open Society and Its Enemies, which is supposed to be a discussion of philosophers. Yeah, Popper was himself a philosopher. And he basically divides all the philosophers into good guys and bad guys. So, Plato is a bad guy, and Aristotle is a bad guy, and Socrates is a good guy, and Karl Popper, obviously, I'm a good guy. Hegel is a bad guy, and Marx, he's very bad. So, I mean, he does that, and he created this concept of the open society, which there's no real definition of,
Hmm.
but everybody throughout history is either supports it or opposes it, and they're the enemies, and we're the people who promote it. So it is fairly well known, at least I mean, that the people who funded that book were the CIA.
Hmm.
So just saying. So I mean, already that traces you back to an event. It was a Cold War. It was done during the Cold War. It was basically an anti-communist, anti-Soviet book, anti-Marxist book. It sought basically to discredit Marxism by suggesting that it was opposed to this wonderful thing called the Open Society. The CIA was heavily involved in
Hmm.
doing that kind of thing back then. I mean, it was trying to develop a kind of intellectual front, a front of intellectuals against Marxism. And it looks to me as if one,
Hmm.
CIA project is operating on the back of another CIA project. So the United States, as I said, is responsible. The CIA is responsible for this whole open society concept, and one of their, well, let's not call him an agent, but somebody who is close to them comes along and promotes it on their behalf in the different conditions of today.
I'm just thinking like a Serbia. I mean, the West already see it as some kind of they don't like Serbia. They don't like
No.
Vucic, even though he's very popular with his own people.
Yeah.
But having this large deposit of lithium, I think, can make it even more complicated.
Mm.
Isn't it true? Like having rich natural resource, it can be a curse, isn't it?
Um, I didn't know, by the way, about the lithium
Yeah.
in Serbia, so thank you for that. But no, I think it is a huge curse. It's one of the reasons why there's been this very unhealthy interest in Ukraine, for
Yeah.
example,
Yeah. Yeah. And the Middle
and
East. Yeah.
the Middle East and
Hmm.
Russia.
Yeah.
I mean, Russia with its enormous natural resources. Now, Madeleine Albright always denied that she ever said that it was, wrong that Russia should have such an overabundance of natural resources
Mhm.
and that they needed to be shared around more equitably. She always said that she never said that. But I've heard others who insist that she did.
Why does she have such a hatred towards Serbian? Remember,
Yeah.
when she was signing a book in the
Mm.
event, there were some people coming protest her. Nobody, nowhere showing that they're Serbians or any nationality or anything. But she just like, oh, those Serbs. Why does she have so much hatred towards Serbia? I don't.
Well, that is a very, very good question. I mean, a lot of people explain it as, that Madeleine Albright is of Jewish origin. Her family came from Czechoslovakia. She was very affected by the history of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
There was a lot of criticism of Serbia in the 90s, very unfair criticism, that they were engaging in genocide and doing all those things. Notice that the same people who accused Serbia of genocide insist that Israel is not committing genocide. But anyway, let's not get into sidetrack with all of that today. So a lot of people are saying that she saw the Serbs as the sequel to the Nazis. Now there may be some truth in that, in Albright's own mental world, about which I'm not particularly well informed. Fundamentally, the reason is because she's a neocon. American neocons insist that every country in the world must follow American orders. Serbia doesn't follow American orders, and that's enough for them to hate these countries.
And going back to the natural resource thing, one thing I just remembered, like, Lu Xun, right? Lu Xun wrote about the Qing dynasty. So what he was saying, the downfall of Qing dynasty is not because Qing dynasty was poor. At the time, I think Qing dynasties, if we're talking about GDP, probably has 1/3 of the world GDP or something. What he was saying is that if you are rich, whether you're rich in with all the gold and silver or natural resource, whatever you're rich with, you better be strong, because the Qing dynasty was rich, but it's not strong. So when you are rich, you are basically a big fat lamb to be slaughtered and eaten. If you are rich, you better be a wolf or a tiger. You can defend yourself. You need to do that. You can't just be rich, right? That's what's going on, right? Still going on, I think, in the world today.
Absolutely. Well, that's why China is developing sixth generation fighter jet, because I don't think that this is the natural inclination of the Chinese people. As I've said many times, if you know your Chinese history, China is a civilization very predisposed to peace. It is. But history has taught them that you can't make assumptions about that others in this world think as you do or want things as you do. And when you're dealing with a society like the United States, I mean, they are endlessly belligerent, and that's the reality.
Another thing is Fico, Czech's prime minister, he visited Moscow. A couple of things. One is apparently Ukraine is threatening to cut the gas to Europe, and Fico, I guess, is discussing this. Why does Ukraine want to cut the gas to Europe? Or threaten Europe like this?
That is an excellent question. We've done a whole series of programs about this on the Duran. I mean, logically, it makes absolutely no sense at all. I mean, Ukraine needs gas. I mean, its heating systems are based around gas. The gas comes from Russia. It transits across Russia. The European Union, as a result of a long-standing agreement, buys more gas from the Russians than it actually needs or wants. And it looks the other way as the Ukrainians tap this gas that passes across Ukraine from Russia and uses it for itself. And the system is called reverse flow, though there's no reverse flow. There's no gas going up the pipelines as the Russian gas goes down the pipelines. It doesn't really work that way. But anyway, that's what has been keeping Ukrainian homes warm for at least 10 years now. So stopping the transfer of Russian gas across Ukraine is a massive it's going to do a massive economic damage to Ukraine. And of course, the other thing that people don't realize is that the Russians pay Ukraine for that. I mean, they pay Ukraine transit fees, which make a significant contribution to Ukraine's budget. So it makes absolutely no sense for the Ukrainians to do this at this time. Now, What happened is that the old transit agreement expires on the 1st of January.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there was discussions about Ukraine renewing it. Ukraine has said it won't be renewed.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why they've taken this decision, as I said, there's no logical explanation for this. But of course, it must be seen in the context of US and EU sanctions. The US and the EU wants to end completely all transfers of gas from Russia to Europe. There's still some Russian gas going to Europe via these pipelines. Some of it goes to Hungary and Slovakia, which are unpopular countries with the EU leadership. So they've put pressure on the Ukrainians to stop the flow of gas. That's the only explanation I can come up with.
And Fico threatened to cut the Ukraine's electricity. So this could, hurt multiple countries. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, it will hurt Ukraine because
Mm-hmm.
Ukraine is very short of electricity, as we know, because the
Mm-hmm.
Russians have been targeting all the power stations. I mean, I believe its production is down to about 20% of where it used to be. It
Mm-hmm.
makes up for these shortages to some extent by importing electricity from the EU, and most of that, about 40% of it, comes from Slovakia.
Mm-hmm.
So now that's going to be switched off. So Ukraine's energy position altogether, its electricity and gas position going forward next year is going to look terrible. But nobody seems to worry about that. Nobody's looking beyond it. It's not a good idea for the EU either, because there are shortages of gas in the EU. This has proved to be a very cold winter.
Mm-hmm.
The amount of stored gas in the reserves has fallen very fast. Gas prices in Europe are rising. The last thing we need at this time are more interruptions to the gas supply, but it looks like that's what we're going to get.
And one more thing, he also talked about, at least that the Chinese media reported that apparently Zelensky trying to bribe him with 500 million euro for him to vote yes to Ukraine's NATO membership. Now,
Yes.
it's not that surprising actually, that Zelensky would try to do something, even though I would think it should be a huge scandal, if he's trying to do that. But it also shows how obsessed Zelensky is to join the NATO, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. They want to do that. I mean, he's absolutely obsessed with joining NATO. The Ukrainians are fixated with joining NATO because that is the only way they think they can win the war. Get NATO to fight the Russians on their behalf, and they need to get into NATO, or he believes he needs to get into NATO in order to achieve that. So he comes up, so he offers Fico these incredible bribes. It tells you how sordid this whole thing has become.
And nobody's criticized him for that, being
No,
so corrupt.
it's not reported. Here in Britain, it's not been reported at all.
No, yeah. Well, but that also tells us how hard the situation is, because it thinks he is so fixated about joining NATO, but that's Russians' red line.
Yeah.
Then it's very hard to find the compromise, the middle ground somewhere, right? So
at the moment, there is no red line. I mean, Putin and Lavrov have spoken about this at length. They've made it very, very clear that NATO membership for Ukraine is not something they're prepared to shift on. They've insisted it must never happen. Lavrov has just given an interview in which he said that this idea of, postponing NATO entry for 10, 15, 20 years is not something the Russians will agree to. And Putin has very pointedly said that Biden made the same proposal to him before the war began, and Putin rejected it. He said, this isn't, you're just telling me that Ukraine will one day join NATO, and I've told you that that's something that we will never agree to. So there it is.
Okay, Britain. There's some report about Britain might be doing some pivot to China. So the foreign minister Lamy just visited China, and then
Yeah.
HSBC chairman, he's going to lead it's called the pivotal UK business delegation to China next month, I
Mm,
think.
mm.
So is the United Kingdom giving China a second look now? Is it?
Well, they should be. I mean, if they had two brain cells to rub together, which is doubtful, they should be. I mean, Britain's economic position is very bad. We are probably now in recession. Living
Mhm.
standards, despite certain claims that you will see in some places, are probably still falling.
Yeah.
Tax burden is rising. All kinds of things are going very badly wrong in Britain. Um, Energy costs are likely to start rising also soon,
Hmm.
and there's upward pressure from inflation. Donald Trump has shown no interest in doing an economic deal with Britain, and it's unlikely to happen. So, what do you do? Where do you look? Britain has a massive problem of underinvestment. Its economy is stagnant and running down. Back in the day, David Cameron and George Osborne, when they were Prime Minister and Chancellor, said, well, the way we're going to turn around Britain is by establishing a really good relationship with China. They spoke about a golden age
Hmm.
in relations with China. The idea was to position Britain as the entry point into Europe of Chinese investment and Chinese businesses, to try to persuade the Chinese to come to Britain. It was a good idea.
Hmm.
It was never followed through properly. Um, but the logic that drove them to seek that still applies. And it's what you would expect Starmer and Lammy and people of that kind to want to do.
Hmm.
The problem is, I remember I live in Britain every single day. I read another anti-Chinese
Hmm.
article in the British media. I mean, most of them, um, I mean, completely crazy. I mean, when I say crazy, I mean it's difficult for people in China to realize how ludicrous these articles are. You know, that
Hmm.
somebody, had a fling with someone who had some connection to China. So this proves that there's a massive Chinese espionage network operating. I mean, it is on that kind of ludicrous level.
Hmm.
So I would like to think that we're going to see a renewal of our relations with China. But the opposition to this is enormously strong and very, very well, very, very strategically located
Hmm.
across the British establishment.
Yeah, this the same with the US media,
Yeah,
as yeah,
yeah.
they always ask very provocative questions and those
Mm,
comments, and yeah, and many times it just lies, they just spreading, yeah,
yeah,
the same thing
yeah,
there, which make it hard for decision makers.
yeah,
And some of the lawmakers, they believe that, right? And
yeah,
they really hate China and think China is a serious
yeah.
threat. So make it very hard to make decisions. And unfortunately, I mean, the media, the mainstream media still has a lot of influence on these people.
Mm,
So
absolutely.
now, isn't it Boris Johnson was trying to get a deal, some kind of free trade deal with at the time I think of Trump or with somebody, with the US, but it didn't go through. I mean,
Yeah.
why is that? Why didn't the United States interested in having a free trade deal with Britain?
Well, I don't think that they see that much advantage to themselves in it
Uh-huh. That's
because
yeah.
the British say they want a free trade deal with the US, but the British
Mhm.
have all kinds of regulations and ideas and concerns. They just want to ring fence off parts of their economy. They don't
Mhm.
want certain agricultural exports. They don't want Americans to carve up and divide and eat up the British health system. They don't want those kind of things.
Uh-huh.
So, I mean, the things that the US would be most interested in, it's probably not really attracted to. And I think also, remember that within the British elite, there continues to be a general feeling that maybe it's the EU anyway we should be going towards. There is still that
Okay.
community of people there who
Mhm.
think like this.
Yeah, the one thing I find that the British is so interesting is you're so divided about this EU question,
Yeah.
isn't it? It seems like forever that's the divide there. It's how it
It's like it is like a religious division. It's like Protestants versus Catholics.
is.
It's Remainers versus Leavers. It has completely divided British society.
Yeah. Also, TikTok. Now I always go back. So Trump just wrote a letter to the Supreme Court. I have to say I was slightly surprised that he did that
Mm,
because I thought he talked a lot, but he will wait until he get into office. But clearly
yeah.
he now the letter is not saying he's support TikTok or against the
No.
ban. The letter he's saying is that okay, let me deal with it. You can put a
No.
hold on it and let me make the decision.
No.
I find that's interesting. Now, isn't that itself tells us TikTok cannot be that big of a national security threat if the
No.
president saying, let's wait.
No, of course, it's not a national security threat. It's a ridiculous idea. What? Because remember, it was Trump who started the whole campaign against
Yeah,
TikTok in the first place.
yeah.
So what this tells us, what this proves, is that he has always seen it as a way to gain leverage over China. This is what he's up to all the time. So he doesn't want a decision that will take that leverage away.
Okay, yeah. So he used that as another chips that
Yeah,
he has.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Yeah,
But the TikTok,
of course. I mean, he misunderstands China completely
mhm,
by going down this route. As I
yeah,
said it before, he approaches negotiations like a construction magnate, which is what he
mm,
is, rather than a diplomat. He doesn't understand the diplomacy and this kind of deal making that he's used to
mhm,
are completely different things.
yeah. And the interesting thing about TikTok is unprecedented in the sense what the whole thing, the ban on TikTok, the legislation is based on, they don't have any evidence that TikTok is some kind of threat. They haven't showed any evidence that TikTok did something to hurt US interests. What they say is that the TikTok, because it's owned by a Chinese company, it has the potential to become a threat. But that isn't that what a fundamental rule for the Western legal system is that you cannot accuse somebody or convict someone before it happens, right?
Absolutely. It goes all the way back to the Romans in point of fact. It's a fundamental principle of Western legal theory.
Yeah,
There's a very,
yeah.
very famous case in the Roman Empire when the Romans discovered that a city called Samos was that there'd been some discussions among some of the leading citizens there about rebelling against the Roman Empire. And then they decided that they weren't going to do it after all. And then afterwards, the Roman authorities discovered all about these reports.
Hmm.
So that there was a big discussion in the Roman Senate about whether Samos and these people should be rounded up and punished.
Hmm.
And a Roman jurist called Cato said, "This is absurd. You can't punish people before they've actually done
Hmm.
something.
Yeah.
I mean, intention without action is not a complete crime.
Hmm.
And mens rea and actus reus, as he puts it.
Hmm.
And that's always been the legal principle ever since. But no,
Yeah.
of course, nowadays we don't worry about these things. There might be, 5,000 years or 3,000 years of law, but
Yeah.
we make the precedents today. We make it all up as we go along. That's the
Yeah.
rules-based international order for you.
Yeah, I mean that would be if the Supreme Court go along with
Yeah,
the US government,
yeah,
that would be
yeah,
ground
yeah.
breaking. Yeah, that would be pretty
Yes, yeah,
astounding. Yes.
yeah. It
Yeah.
would be. It would be astonishing, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
And one more thing is Assad wife, they were talking about they divorced, but clearly that's not true. So
No,
what is that about?
a very ugly story, actually. I mean, there's Assad in Moscow,
Hmm.
so they're again trying to make trouble. They say that the marriage is about to break down.
Hmm.
They want to discredit and ruin him as much as they can.
Yeah.
They spread these stories about him that are completely untrue. It starts in Britain. They then pretend that it all starts in Turkey, whereas in fact it actually did begin in Britain. Um, And to make it even more cruel, it turns out that she's extremely ill and
Yeah.
likely to die. And the one thing that everybody up to now has acknowledged is that the two were devoted to each other.
Yeah.
So you spread this really ugly story about this this couple. Even if Assad had done all of the things that they said, and he may have done some of them, but if he'd done all of them, it still wouldn't have justified a story like this.
But what's the purpose of them spreading these kind of a rumor? Just to hurt him, to make him feeling bad and terrible? I mean, what's the goal here?
Well, it is, but I mean, it's also very much the style of the British media. I mean, both Putin and Xi Jinping have died many times, if you believe the British media. Just to say, the amount of illnesses that Putin has, he's got Parkinson's, cancer, senility, Alzheimer's, heart problems, syphilis. He's got them all.
No wonder. I mean, they're going down, right? I mean, if you keep on telling these kind of lies, at some point, people will just say, "Oh, that's it."
I would say that the British public is very, very tough-minded about these kind of things. They're used to these sort of stories. Mostly, they're not taken very seriously here, but it doesn't prevent our media machine, churning them out, and they do so continuously.
Sometimes I wonder whether they're just emotionally wishful thinking, hoping this is right. And even like Hillary Clinton one time was in an interview talking about Putin. Of course, she hates him. And she said, "Oh, look at the interview. He was talking to somebody. Something is not right about him. There was nothing wrong with him at all. But in the interview, something is not right. He must be in some kind of a health issue, whatever." She just make it up on the spot.
Absolutely. Correct.
So, but I think it's an emotional thing. They wish, that is,
Absolutely.
So unbelievable. But okay, Happy New Year, because it's going to be next year.
It is indeed. It's going to be next year. We're going to be talking.
Bye.
Bye.